Hello, I'm Mercedes Stevenson, and this is the West Block, politics, perspectives, and players. Warnings continue throughout eastern Australia, in New South Wales and Queensland, where bushfires continue to destroy homes and farmland. Australia is the driest continent in the world, and according to the Weather Bureau, which is Australia's version of Environment Canada, climate change is impacting the bushfire season. Just how much of an impact is climate change having on the bushfires that we're seeing in Australia? Joining me now from Hobart is David Bowman, professor of Pyrogeography and Fire Science, as well as the Fire Centre Director at the University of Tasmania in Australia. Welcome to the show, Mr. Bowman.
Pleasure.
Let's start with the bushfire season in Australia. You have been studying the fires there for years now and watching how they progress. How have bushfires in Australia been evolving and changing, and what are you seeing this year?
So that's right. What we're seeing with the bushfire situation now is that our fire seasons have actually merged with the Northern Hemisphere. It's hard to believe that a couple of weeks ago in Hobart, around Hobart, there were uncontrolled fires, whilst there were fires burning in California. We had 3 total fire ban days. Luckily, those fires didn't escalate. But that just gives you a sense of how early, this is our early spring. Tassie is the most southern part of Australia. And what we're seeing up in New South Wales and Queensland is, 1 million hectares already burnt, 1 million hectares. It's 8 or 10 times more than you would expect in one season, and the season has barely begun.
Why do you think the season is so much worse this year than it has been in previous years?
Oh yeah, this is at the end of this year, this coming summer, because we have 2 years for our summer. I'm absolutely confident that this is a transformative event historically for Australia. This will be our bushfire Gallipoli. This will be something that's going to change Australia forever. It's just set up like that. Now, hopefully I'll be wrong and there could be luck and we could get an ex-tropical cyclone that could bring an enormous amount of water to the east coast of Australia and make the fire season, just an anomalously early but short-lived one. But all of the forecasts are telling us that there is simply no rain coming, and what we're doing is we're getting this horrible beating really from the synoptic systems, where we get pretty well every 3 days now these incredibly strong wind bursts coming through, and then you get like these wind changes which are occurring, oscillating, and they're driving these fires. The head of the fire changes to the flank of the fire. The flank of the fire changes to the head of the fire, switching backwards and forwards. And in some cases, we've got weather systems developing over the fires that are creating their own weather. So the communities involved are absolutely, what do you say to a community that just does not know their future?
Can you give us a sense of what it looks like on the ground with the spread of these fires for the animals, for the people who are living there, and for the communities?
Well, one of the big unspoken stories of these fires is the epic smoke pollution. We've had smoke pollution in Brisbane and Sydney, which is, eclipses the bad sort of epic coal pollution you get in China. And so people are really suffering from this horrendous bushfire smoke pollution. What I'm worried about will be the classic double punch, which will come with these fires, that we're going to get after the fires are over. We're going to get heavy rain, very steep terrain, so there's going to be erosion, washouts. Here in Tassie, on fire grounds, we've lost bridges because the fires are burning so much more intensely than they used to, because the fuel is so, basically it's desiccated. Look, I've got to explain, around Hobart, the trees are dying back now, and this is spring. They're beginning to shed. The evergreen eucalypts are beginning to shed leaves. They're so stressed. It's just unimaginable what the summer is going to be like if we achieve, the sort of the classic climate change type summer with the anomalous weather conditions. And I might add, in temperature anomalies, we've got in New South Wales, days where it's 8 degrees above average. These are like, tremendously extreme, weather conditions, just day after day. These very hot days, hot nights, strong winds, and desiccating drought. It's really, truly a climate and weather-driven fire crisis.
Obviously, 2019 is a very bad year, but have you seen a progression over the last few years where the fire season is getting worse?
Oh, absolutely. We're on this escalator. I've been studying fires for 40 years, and in Tasmania, nothing much had happened. That southern Australia had been hit by these fires in the first decade of this century. And then this decade in Tasmania, we saw, like an incredible fire event in 2013. That I was speechless at the sort of, that's just like a career-changing, fire event. But then in 2016, I saw something even more incredible. And you'd think, well, that's, I need a couple more lives now to wrap my mind around this. But then in 2019, which is not over, we saw something that even eclipsed 2013 and 2016 in its bizarreness. And then, of course, the fire season for this fire season, which we're still in the calendar year of 2019, has already started in Tasmania. So that it's just, it's exactly like what's happening in Canada and California, that the fire seasons are stretching out, the fires are more aggressive, the weather is incredibly adverse for fires. So, yeah, we're, as I say, like you start to join the dots. And I like to say that we're on this bridge now. We're going from the reality, which we can all understand, to that hypothetical reality the climate modelers were trying to tell us about. And I might add, as we cross that bridge, we're learning all sorts of new things about fire behaviour and about ecology. There are lots of surprises coming our way. So that's also a little bit bewildering and discombobulating for a scientist, because your conceptual models, I suppose, your hypotheses are all they're all on the table. It's all everything. It's extremely exciting as a scientist to experience this, but as a human being and somebody very concerned about my community here in Hobart, I'm petrified what could happen to my capital city. And obviously my heart goes out to the incredible suffering right across New South Wales and into southern Queensland. I mean, this is just, it's just, you're going to hear a lot more about this story. I'll put it to you that way.
The question is always asked now about the possible link between climate change and this kind of weather. Your Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, and some of his cabinet colleagues, even the Premier of New South Wales, have come out and said this is not the time to talk about climate change and bushfires. Do you agree with that sentiment?
No, that's I can understand that. And I must admit, as a fire scientist, previously, like in the 09 fire in Victoria, which killed 174 people, I didn't want to talk about that fire event whilst the fire crisis was evolving. It was completely inappropriate. But now the science is much stronger. And the thing is, philosophically, I'm left with a dilemma that when the fires aren't burning, people aren't banging on my door wanting my opinion about fires. The only time they want to know about fires is when the fires are occurring. So I've decided, and many of the other fire scientists have decided, that we have to talk about this problem. We have to discuss it and try to get some depth, because, if I hadn't been speaking out in the media, the politicians certainly were, and they were engaged really in quite an unbecoming, both sides or every side, there's multiple sides of politics. It was really, as a fire scientist, it was like looking at a primary school, quarrel. It was really not deep. It was not leadership. It wasn't informed, and it wasn't particularly hopeful. And I think one of the responsibilities we have as scientists is to, exactly the same as a physician, to explain to a patient that they have a serious issue, but to provide them with pathways to get better. And that's what we have to do. We have to also be providing pathways and solutions and hope and encouragement for the younger generation. It's absolutely horrible to think about the younger ones. They're little kids who've been drawing pictures. My world is on fire. As anybody knows anything about little kids, they shouldn't be drawing those sorts of pictures. We've got to give the younger generation, the people who are going to become the new leaders and the new firefighters, a sense of hope. And we've got to do that by talking about this in a responsible and informed way. And that's where the scientists absolutely must talk about this, and they must talk about climate change, but they must also explain to the community this is a complex issue, and it's not really a time for sloganeering. It's a time for agitating for more resources and more inquiry and more community capacity and more hope. Because this is frankly, this is our Churchillian moment. This is going to be really the big thing for Australia, whether we can get to grips with this, because we are so particularly vulnerable given the dryness of our environment. That the continent is designed to provide these horrendous weather setups. Just our position in the Southern Ocean, the climatology of the continent gives us this terrible fire weather. Climate change is the accelerant. Climate change is the turbocharger. We already had a terrible problem, and now the problem is it's going into a really bad place.
You mentioned what needs to be done. What should governments be doing in Australia and in Canada to help mitigate these fires?
Well, going back to the medical analogy, if you've got somebody who's sick and they're a smoker, then even though their disease might not be directly related to smoking, you would encourage them to quit smoking, because that's going to get them into a better place. And that's exactly how I would feel about decarbonisation, that we've got to reduce carbon pollution. We've got to try to stabilise our climate. But that's a long-range aspiration. I'm far more interested in the short-range adaptation to make fire-safe communities. So we've got to do both, but it's quite ridiculous to say, if we have a plan to reduce carbon over the next 15 years, that's really not going to help with an immediate problem. The way we're going to solve this problem is by fuels management, and fuels management taking the fight up to where the fight needs to be had, and that's right on the perimeter of our towns, cities, factories, assets, mines, farms, national parks, all of the things, the values, assets in our landscape. We've got to start from there and work back. There's been too much discussion about burning, the outback. It's like, that's tremendous. We could burn the outback, and we could invest a lot of resources in burning, the backcountry, as we call it. But that's not going to help Sydney. Sydney, there was already this week a fire right in the guts of Sydney, and there are fires, not too far now from Sydney, so up in the Blue Mountains. So we've really got to, say, okay, what we've got to do, say, with the Blue Mountains communities is to get really intensive fuel management around every one of those towns and suburbs, which back into some pretty combustible bush. And then once we've achieved that, and that's probably a 10-year plan, then we can start worrying about the more distant, and doing the more distant work. But the resourcing has got to go into building capacity and building community awareness And it's exactly the same in Canada and in the Western US.
Mr. Bowman, thank you very much for your time. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks so much for joining us. For the West Block, I'm Mercedes Stevenson.